Joe Schmid. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited for this.
Yeah, me too. So the plan of action today is to pick what we both take to be the strongest argument for God's existence, discuss it, and then discuss the strongest argument against God's existence. And we've decided on this, but only 5 minutes ago. So much of my own response to it will be on the fly, off the top of my head as a philosopher. So hopefully I'm talented enough to do that. But why don't we jump into it? I think let's start with the argument for God's existence. Joe, I pass that over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are lots of different arguments for and against God's existence. We're just going to choose. We had a number of candidates for which is the best. As always, a cumulative case will be like the best argument, but that's kind of cheating, so we're just looking at the best individual argument. And yeah, like I said, we couldn't quite decide on which is the best argument, so we just picked one that was in the running, and that is a version of the contingency argument. So contingency arguments, it's really a family of arguments. It's not just a single argument. And they come in many different varieties, many different shapes, many different forms. So I guess I will articulate a kind of plain vanilla, bog standard contingency argument without getting into all the bells and whistles about maybe you can make it a modal contingency argument and then use system S5 and all that crazy stuff. We'll just get like a bog standard contingency argument. Okay, so I think one thing to say at the outset is that the argument is probably best broken up into two different stages. The first stage is trying to argue for some kind of necessary foundational reality that explains contingent things. I will explain what these terms mean in a second. And then the second stage tries to say that that necessary foundational reality is God, or at least is very much God-like. So it's got two different stages. Let's go through stage one. So firstly, let's get some terms on the table. So what is a contingent thing? A contingent thing is something that exists, but it can fail to exist. It's at least possible that it fails to exist. And we're not just talking like epistemic possibility, like, oh, for all I know, it could fail to exist. Instead, we're talking about like a real possibility, like reality could have been such that this thing is absent from reality. So philosophers call that metaphysical possibility. Okay, so yeah, contingent thing is something that exists but could fail to exist, whereas a necessary thing is something that exists but cannot fail to exist. Likewise, a contingent truth is just something which is true, but it could have been false. And a necessary truth is something which is true, but it could not have been false. Okay, so we got some definitions on the table, and now we can get into the argument itself. So I guess the first premise of the argument would just be saying something along the lines of, hey, there are contingent things. So, there are some things around us which can fail to exist. I could fail to exist if my parents had never met. You could fail to exist. This water bottle can fail to exist. Lots of things around us seem like they don't have to be in reality. So, yeah, we got some contingent things. That's the first premise. The second premise would be contingent things, whether individually or collectively, have an explanation. Why might we think that contingent things have an explanation? Well, there are several reasons that people have proposed. One is just that, it's a kind of just inductive generalization from our experience with contingent things. So it seems like every time you come across a contingent thing, or even a group of contingent things, they uniformly have an explanation. Just look around my room. Like, pick any individual contingent thing, like my phone, or me, or even the molecules that make me up, or the lamp that's right here that you can't see, and my mic. These things are all contingent, and we uniformly find them all to have an explanation. And that's also true with, collections of things, like consider the collection of things in my room. There is an explanation for why that collection exists by citing various antecedent historical causal factors that produce the things. Okay, so one kind of motivation for this is just that, listen, in all of our experience, contingent things have explanations, and so we can inductively generalize. It doesn't prove it with absolute certainty, and we can't, it doesn't logically entail what I'm about to say, but it does give us some inductive reason to think that all contingent things, whether individually or collectively, have an explanation. Okay, so that's the kind of inductive motivation. There are other motivations. Some people just find this premise very, very intuitive. It just seems incredibly plausible to them when they just reflect on contingency. So what is it to be a contingent thing? Well, to be a contingent thing, it's like it didn't have to exist, right? So like there are some ways that reality could be such that it exists, and there are some ways that reality could be such that it doesn't exist. Well, then why does it exist? Like if it genuinely could have been on either side of this quote-unquote dichotomy between existence and non-existence, why does it fall on this side of the dichotomy? What explains that? Nothing about that entity itself can explain it. No entity can explain its own existence. It can't pull itself into reality somehow. So why then does it exist if it genuinely could have failed to exist? There is that kind of puzzlement and that mystery that seems to require some kind of account, seems to require some kind of explanation. Or at least so some people have argued. So it seems intuitive. That's a kind of intuitive motivation. There are various other sorts of motivations that philosophers have proposed for principles of this sort, saying that contingent things have explanations. One might think that, hey, if there could be contingent things that lack explanation, why don't we just witness whole floods of contingent things, coming into existence with no explanation at all? Why don't we see that? Perhaps the best explanation for why we don't witness that kind of chaos is this principle that that's just not possible. It's just not possible for contingent things to exist without an explanation. So there's that sort of argument. Other people say if you deny this principle, then we'd have to take seriously the claim that contingent things immediately around us, and contingent things in our own minds, we'd have to take seriously the possibility that those lack an explanation and aren't adequately connected up with the external world. So we'd have to take very seriously, like certain skeptical threats. Again, we're not going to get into all these motivations. I just want to point to the audience that the motivations that I've sketched are not the only ones that philosophers have developed. Okay, so that's the second premise, that contingent things, whether individually or collectively, have an explanation. The third premise would just be that hey, consider the collection of all the contingent things that there are. By that second premise, this collection of all the contingent things that there are is going to have an explanation. The explanation can't be in terms of a contingent thing, because any contingent thing is part of the very thing that we're seeking an explanation of here, right? We're considering the collection of all contingent things. Citing a contingent thing to explain the collection of all contingent things is like citing a penguin to explain why there are penguins. That's not a good explanation of why there are penguins. You just cited a penguin. You're presupposing the very thing we're seeking an explanation of. So basically, the third premise would be something along the lines of consider the collection of all contingent things. The explanation of that can't be in terms of a contingent thing, and so then we conclude that if it's not in terms of a contingent thing, it must then be in terms of a necessary thing. And so there's a necessary thing which explains the contingent things, and that is the end of stage one. We've gotten at least one necessary foundational reality which explains contingent things. That's the bare bones summary of a bog standard contingency stage one argument. And then stage two, you try to tease out various divine attributes of this being. Now, I harbor lots of reservations about stage two, more than I do about stage one. But very briefly, some people try to say well, hey, it seems like, any physical thing is, arguably any physical thing is contingent. Seems like we can conceive of there being no physical things. Seems like physical things can be destroyed, etc. So maybe this necessary foundation of reality would have to be non-physical. Consider hypotheses about how many there are. Well, it seems like the simplest hypothesis is that there's just one. Why cite more? So we've got just, very plausibly, one non-physical, necessary foundation of all contingent things. We're getting closer to God. Now, this thing can't kind of deterministically entail that there are contingent things, because it's necessary, and whatever is, kind of necessitated by something that's necessary is itself necessary. So the link, the explanatory link between this necessary thing and contingent things can't itself be necessary. It'd have to be contingent. And perhaps the best explanation for there being a contingent link between the necessary and the contingent is that the necessary thing is endowed with a kind of free will, and it chose to bring about contingent things. So maybe that's the best explanation for there being a contingent link there. And so, hey, we've got a necessary foundation of reality, which is non-physical. It's got free will, and so it's personal in at least some sense. We're edging closer and closer and closer to God. That's the thought. And maybe at this stage we can just say, well, like, hey, the best explanation for why there would be such a thing at all is just that God exists. Okay, anyway, I know I've taken up a lot of time, and there's so much more that can be said, and I myself don't agree with everything that I just said, but that is, that's one of the more plausible arguments for theism, I'll say.
I think you're right. I think that it is probably one of the oldest. I mean, I think that most people's kind of pre-reflective reasons for believing in God probably come down to, insofar as it's not grounded in just religious experience, it's probably just a very general reflection on the existence of the universe, that there has to be some explanation why this whole thing exists, which is a version of the cosmological argument, a very primitive version. But I think it intuitively appeals to a lot of people, and it does to me as well. I'm open to thinking that the argument succeeds. I'm not convinced that it does, particularly with respect to stage 2. I think most theistic arguments are guilty of jumping from the modest conclusion, which their premises really do warrant, to the conclusion that God exists. And they just kind of go, well, you know, it's probably the rest of the divine attributes too. But that doesn't follow. I think a lot of theistic philosophers have been lacking in imagination in coming up with alternative possibilities. So let's look at stage 1 then. The first premise was that there are contingent things, reasonable enough. The second is that for any contingent thing or collection of contingent things, there is an explanation why it exists. And I take it that those two premises entail then 3, there is an explanation why all contingent things exist. That seems to follow. So then really the fourth premise is, if there is an explanation for all contingent things, it is a necessary being. And then 5, there is a necessary being. So what premise in this argument is, in your mind, the weakest, and why? And we can go from there.
Well, I certainly think there are contingent things. That's denying.
As do I. I'm glad
denying
we're on
that
the
is
same
not
page.
very plausible. I used to be much more confident in that second premise, which we can call a restricted version of the principle of sufficient reason. So, just for the audience, the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR, dates back very far, in fact. But it received a very rigorous and lively defense by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and he basically, said that any truth has to have a sufficient reason or explanation for its obtaining. Now that's quite strong. We can and arguably entails modal collapse, but theistic modal collapse is where everything turns out to be necessary. But contemporary theistic philosophers have, I think, rightly recognized that we can weaken this principle and still get interesting arguments up and running. So we can call this a kind of weakened or restricted version of the principle of sufficient reason, which is focused on a restricted class of things, namely contingent things, and saying that they have explanations. So I used to be much more confident in that than I am now, and the reason is because not so much that I think that there are like good counterexamples to it, but I still am sympathetic with it, but I worry about some of the arguments for it, and it's not clear to me that they succeed. So I just worry that it's undermotivated. Right, yeah. So I mean, like, let's go through some of the arguments that I gave. So like the inductive argument. One problem with this sort of argument is that we can also use induction to motivate lots of principles that are incompatible either with this argument itself or with theism more generally. So like here's one such inductive principle, contingent things, when they have explanations, the explanations themselves are contingent. This principle is likewise uniformly and universally supported by our experience. Every time we come across a contingent thing and we find it to have an explanation, we always see in our experience that it's a contingent explanation. Contingent things are explained in terms of other contingent things. And so then we might worry about just supporting, just the induction on its own can't decipher between which of these principles that we should accept. And it seems like if we accept this one about contingent things when they have explanations, have contingent explanations, that's not going to be compatible with with theism, because theism posits ultimately a necessary thing, which explains contingent things. So that's one worry for and there are other sorts of principles that one can appeal to, which would be incompatible with traditional theism and which are equally motivated by induction. So, for instance, the claim that anything that we come across has an explanation in terms of some prior condition or conditions, whether explanatorily prior or temporally prior. That's also universally supported by our experience, but it would entail, if we accepted it, that there couldn't be a foundational thing which doesn't have an explanation in terms of other things, like God. So this principle, too, is incompatible with theism, and it's equally supported by induction. So I worry about at least relying on induction alone here. It's not going to be able to support this principle used in the argument over and against other principles that are either incompatible with the argument or incompatible with theism itself.
Yes. So I think that what the proponent of the argument would have to say, they'd have to grant that these other principles, or at least the first one you mentioned, that for any contingent thing, its explanation is a further contingent thing. The empirical or inductive support for that principle is just as strong as the inductive support for this principle in the argument. But I think the right thing to say there is that it will follow then that we can't give only inductive support for this premise, that we can acknowledge that empirical or inductive evidence supports both of these principles, but that given that we have other reasons for supporting the explanatory principle in the contingency argument in conjunction with the other premises of the argument, that will collectively give us reason to reject that second version of the explanatory principle, because if the contingency argument is sound, and if there are other reasons for accepting this explanatory principle, it will just follow that second explanatory principle is false. And that isn't to say that the inductive evidence doesn't support the second premise. We would just say it does, and it lends credibility to the premise. But given those other points I mentioned, the success of this argument outweighs the inductive support for these incompatible principles. That's probably what they would have to say. And that acknowledges that you can't have induction alone, but it would save the support that it brings to the second premise. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes sense. I guess, like, the worry that one would have is, like, it's adequately supporting, it's adequately supporting so as to justify our acceptance of the relevant principle is kind of parasitic on these other supports, and they're succeeding. So, like, so long as the non-theist can go through those and show that either they too are parasitic on the others, or that they too are inadequately motivated, or that they don't motivate the principle, then the non-theist will then have successfully, undercut the argument. So this response would only be part of a broader non-theistic response to this premise. But I do think it's nevertheless an important part, because it would show that the induction doesn't adequately justify by itself acceptance of the premise. It needs to be supplemented, basically.
I think it needs to be supplemented with support for the other premises, but wouldn't you acknowledge, and this I'm just thinking off the top of my head, that if we have good reason to accept the other premises of the stage one of the contingency argument, then, and let's say all we have is inductive support for the explanatory principle, once we reach the conclusion that there is a necessary being and we have support for the other premises, the collective weight of the argument as a whole will then defeat the inductive support for these incompatible principles. So there's an asymmetry, I guess, is what I'm trying to
No, because getting to a necessary thing relies on that first premise and justified acceptance thereof. I mean, we could equally argue that together with all the other premises and my reverse premise, the parallel premise, we can infer the negation of the original premise and the original argument. And so then I could equally say my argument, sufficiently justifies rejecting that original premise. So I wouldn't agree that if we can motivate the other steps in the argument and we only had induction, then we could somehow break the symmetry.
Well, okay, so you're right. The third, the conclusion that follows from the two premises is that in the case of the second explanatory principle would be that nothing would follow, right? Because let's say we said that there are contingent things, and every contingent thing or collection of contingent things has an explanation in terms of other contingent things. you would get an incoherent result that the collection of contingent things has an explanation in terms of other contingent things, which is just a contradiction.
Right. So if that's why I was very careful when I said the competing principle. I said contingent things, when they have an explanation, they have a contingent explanation. So
okay.
So once we run this, we see that with the other premises of the argument, we can see that, and now consider the collection of all contingent things. Well, suppose it had an explanation. By the principle that I've been mounting, which is supported by induction, it would follow that it would have to have an explanation in terms of contingent thing. But that can't be for the same reasons that the original argument said. That would be a circular explanation. And so it follows that this collection of contingent things can't have an explanation, and that's incompatible with the original first premise, that every contingent thing or collection of contingent things has an explanation. So I do think we could just run the argument in reverse with the same sort of inductive support, and so I don't think symmetry can be broken in this sort of way.
Okay. I'll have to think about that, but I do think the point I agree on is that to run any kind of inductive argument, then it will be parasitic upon other reasons you could give for that second premise. So then what about intuition? It does seem plausible to me and to many people that it just seems obvious, for lack of a better, more sophisticated way to articulate it, that there has to be an explanation for why something exists when its non-existence is certainly possible. Or at the very least, the burden of proof would be on the one who would want to exempt any contingent thing from that requirement. That it's more plausible than not for any particular contingent thing that it has an explanation until proven otherwise, so to speak. What do you think about the intuition argument?
So, one thing to note is that intuitions are, we each have our own sort of intuitive reactions to various premises, and they are going to justify at least those who share the intuition, I think. And they're going to justify them in accepting it in the absence of defeaters for their acceptance of the premise. So whether or not this is a good motivation for the premise depends on two things then. Firstly, whether one, in coming to this argument, even shares the intuition. And secondly, whether there are defeaters for the content of the intuition. And do I share the intuition? I think so. I think I find it plausible. It's not like self-evident to me. It's not like the law of non-contradiction or something, where that's just manifestly obvious to me. Sorry, dialetheists, but I'm not going to barge on that one. I don't think. So it's not like that luminously obvious to me. But I do think it's like plausible to a degree. And so it retains some intuitive plausibility for me. Now, then the question is, are there some defeaters? Well, one thing is I know many people who just don't find this intuitive at all, and in fact they find it intuitively just clearly false. They just think it's obviously possible for there to be contingent things that don't have explanations. I know many people that I met in real life who say this, what? That premise just seems intuitively false to me. So, and when that happens, I find that it's hard for me to. I don't have a worked out theory of how we should go about responding to intuition disagreement. But sometimes, at the very least, it makes me start questioning. It's why am I privileging my own intuitions rather than theirs? Is this not just a result of my kind of socio-historical, personal history that's influencing my having the intuitions? And they're just kind of personal, socio-historical, whatever his factors leading up to their intuitions. I'm not quite sure why I should put so much stock in my intuitions as opposed to theirs. Now, I also don't know what to make of that because, that my acceptance of that principle itself relies on my own intuitions, and some other people lack intuitions in favor of that principle, and maybe they think that the principle is intuitively false. So I also might worry whether or not that principle that I'm relying on is self-defeating. But you can at the very least see how this could diminish my confidence when I run into other seemingly equally well-positioned people who think that it's just obviously false to them or intuitively false to them, and it starts to rattle you. It's So that's one thing. Potential defeaters from intuition disagreement. And I don't have a worked out theory about how to respond to that, how to update one's own beliefs in light of intuition disagreement. That's one thing to say. And then I guess another thing to say is humans seem to be, I don't know, like, our intuitions go crazy when it comes to like highfalutin metaphysical abstract hypotheses that are very far removed from ordinary experience. We see that they can justify like almost just about any competing views in philosophy, and it's not clear to me how much stock we should put in intuitions concerning intuitions and principles that have, that are very far removed from ordinary humdrum experience and make generalizations about, collections of entire contingent things, even in like a whole pluriverse and the entire history of the universe and so on. So given our kind of track record of intuitions misfiring on those sorts of questions, abstract, highfalutin, metaphysical topics, far removed from ordinary humdrum experience, we may not want to put as much stock in these sorts of intuitions as one might otherwise want to put stock in. But again, I don't have like a worked out theory about how exactly this should affect the intuitions. So it's difficult. These considerations are very difficult, and they just decrease my confidence in the sort of intuition motivation.
Well, it's going to be hard to have a more substantive exchange on this point because largely I just agree with you. They're the same points that bother me. Because, when you talk to William Lane Craig about premise one of the Kalam cosmological argument, which is very similar, whatever begins to exist has a cause. There are relevant differences between explanations and causes, but it's similar enough where William Lane Craig will claim that the premise is just intuitively obvious that something cannot come from nothing. That's very similar to the claim that every contingent thing has an explanation. And while gun to my head, I still think the premise is more plausibly true than not, and just kind of based on looking at it, just the intuition. A lot of people don't share that, and I certainly don't share the confidence that William Lane Craig has in it. I mean, it depends on what you mean by intuition, because something that I said to Alex Malpass was that if we define intuition broadly enough, I do think it will follow that our evaluation of large-scale metaphysical theories always just comes down to intuition. Now, I don't know what you think of that, but if that's the case, I worry that shooting down intuition in this blanket kind of way will bring down all of philosophy as an enterprise. And I realize that's a metaphilosophical question, like what is philosophy, what does it do? But that would be my worry, is that if we just wholesale reject the reliability of intuition, we'll bring down philosophy in its entirety. What do you make of that?
It's a serious worry, and that's why I do accept something broadly along the lines of, if something seems plausible to one, or if it strikes one as true, or in other words, if one has an intuition that is true, then that gives one at least some degree of justification for accepting it in the absence of defeaters. I, broadly speaking, accept either that principle or something close to it. So it's just, the question is, what is a legitimate defeater? And we just have to be careful that we don't, in one context, mount certain defeaters for intuitions that would have the disastrously skeptical consequences that you just mentioned. So we always have to be very careful when we're mounting defeaters. So I take a kind of default trust towards states of seemings, like if it perceptually seems, or perceptually appears to me to be the case, that there's like a water bottle or whatever, then I'm justified in taking there to be a water bottle in the absence of feeders, etc. Same with like moral appearances or seemings, same with logical ones, etc. And these metaphysical ones, there's a default stance towards them, or a default presumption in favor of them. Because I think otherwise we'd be, just cast into skepticism or something like that.
Right.
But yeah, then the question is just, what is a legitimate defeater? And also, how do defeaters interact with our levels of confidence? Because we may think that, okay, maybe a bad track record of these highfalutin abstract metaphysical intuitions applied beyond ordinary humdrum experience, maybe that should at least seriously diminish our confidence in certain things, but it doesn't have to altogether make us just reject them or whatever. The intuition could just more weakly support the relevant claims. So that's also something that we need to keep in mind, is whether the defeater is just kind of like tempers the confidence that you should have in it, or whether it just means that your intuition doesn't support it in any way whatsoever. So there are lots of difficult and interesting questions to explore here. And I'm sort of just highlighting things that at least seriously temper my confidence in trusting the relevant intuitions, not so much that we should just reject the intuitions whole scale. And again, the way that I articulated the worry would only apply to like highfalutin abstract metaphysical principles applied in contexts very far removed from ordinary humdrum experience. So that's also something to keep in mind, that the way that I articulated the worry would only apply to that. And again, here I'm not necessarily, as a more general, like as a broader point, I'm not necessarily, putting forward objections to the argument that I think definitely succeed. I've only ever, from the start, you just asked me which of these premises do you think is on least solid footing. And so what I'm doing here is just noting some of my worries, some
Sure.
reservations that kind of pull on my mind, that kind of bother me, that kind of bug me.
Yes.
Not necessarily that I'm staking a flag and saying that, these are successful objections or responses.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm just analyzing them and thinking them through with you.
I think you made some really
have an axe to
interesting
grind, and I don't know either.
Yeah, and I think you've made some really interesting and good points here that have not only clarified the argument but also have pushed these objections further and kind of forced refinements of them. If I could just say one other.
So it seems.
I could just say one other thing about the argument. Right here, we've been focusing on the motivations for the relevant principle, and I've just been voicing some worries for the motivations. And again, we haven't gone through all the motivations. There are a number of others. But also, one of the premises in the argument I also have reservations about, which is if there is an explanation of the collection of contingent things, then it must be in terms of a necessary thing. I also worry about that. So I don't know if you wanted to turn to my worries about that.
Sure, let's do that briefly. And because I think when it comes to stage 2, we're probably just going to be on the exact same page. So to keep this within our hour limit, we'll probably just end the discussion on the cosmological argument here. So if this is the last point you want to discuss, then let's do it.
Okay, sounds good. And if we need, we can go like 15 minutes over as well. I can't go too much longer than 15 minutes over the hour, but that's okay with me. So
for anyone who doesn't know, Joe is a PhD student at Princeton. And so his schedule is extremely hectic, and I'm very grateful that he gave us this time to talk. So thank you, Joe.
I appreciate that, because not all interviewers are aware of that. So like when I say a certain period of time, sometimes they go considerably longer, and that's never fun. Okay.
No, I got you. Interviewer ethics.
Yeah, exactly.
101.
Okay. Anyway, I appreciate it. And I have to also be sensitive to this because I am an interviewer as well for my channel. So I'm very much anyway. Okay, so my worry for this premise, and again, it's just like a worry or reservation. I'm not saying I can show this premise to be false or anything. So I actually agree that you can't explain the collection of contingent things in terms of a contingent thing, in terms of one of the members of that collection, because I do think that would be just a circular explanation, and I don't think circular explanations are explanations at all. I think that non-circularity is a condition on being a successful or adequate explanation. I fully agree with that, and that's standard in the literature on explanation. But just because the explanation is not in terms of a contingent being, it doesn't follow that it has to be in terms of a necessary being. I mean, why must the explanation cite the activity of a being specifically? I mean, there are lots of different kinds of explanations that we can offer. Certain structural explanations, logical explanations, explanations by appeal to metaphysical principles. Earlier on, I remember I was appealing to a metaphysical principle to explain why there is no chaos, right? If you recall, I mean, it wasn't really me. I was mentioning a motivation that people give for the causal principle, and the motivation was we were trying to explain the fact that we don't witness widespread chaos in reality, like things just popping into existence willy-nilly, uncaused, or without any explanation. And they were trying to offer an explanation for that by citing a metaphysical principle, namely that's it's just not possible for that sort of thing to occur. That's not an explanation in terms of the activity of a being. It's not like there's a being which is like preventing things from coming into existence uncaused or whatever, right? So there are lots of different kinds of explanations, and some of them don't cite the activity of a being or anything like that. So then, I would agree that if the collection of contingent things had an explanation in terms of a being, it couldn't be a contingent being because that's part of the explanation. Then it would have to be a necessary being, yeah. But why think that the explanation of the collection of contingent things would have to be in terms of the activity of a being? That's always what I've wondered. And actually, a lot of not all of them, but a lot of defenders of the contingency argument have been conspicuously silent on this point. And we can at least, conceive of. I mean, maybe there's some like metaphysical principle to the effect that. Like there just had to be some contingent thing or other, and maybe we can derive that using other like really plausible principles or a priori knowable principles. There are certain theories of metaphysical modality that, together with certain other, I'm thinking of like branching actualism. For those who are interested, I published a paper with Alex Malpass on that. There are certain principles in like metaphysical modality that might be able to deliver that, together with certain principles about time, that might be able to deliver that it's necessary that some contingent thing or other exists. And maybe we can cite these sorts of views about morality, modality, and time to explain why there are contingent things, because there just had to be. It's similar to why people say, well, why don't we witness chaos all around us? Well, because that's just not possible. It just had to be the case that contingent things have explanations. So it's very similar to that sort of explanation that they give in that context, just by citing certain metaphysical principles that themselves are necessary. So anyway, again, I'm not saying that that's a good or successful explanation. My point is just that in order for this argument to work, the defender of the argument, the contingency argument, that is, stage one, the proponent thereof would have to rule these sorts of explanations out. They would have to say that there cannot be any sort of explanation, or at least any sort of adequate explanation, of the contingent things that exist. There can't be an explanation of that which doesn't cite the activity of a being. And I don't quite see why I should accept that. So that's another sort of worry that one might raise for stage one.
I think that's a very astute point, that advocates of this argument, in the limited amount that I've read their defenses of it, don't address this point at all. The assumption made is that if you can rule out contingent beings as the explanation, it'll just follow by definition that it's a necessary being. I wonder, though, like, I at least understand what's being asserted when somebody says that the collection of contingent things is explained by a necessary being. We may object to that on other grounds, but I at least understand the claim being made. It's not immediately clear to me what it means to say that the existence of contingent things is explained by a metaphysical principle. I'm open to it, but I think you would need to fill in the detail, make that specific for me to understand like what the proposal is. And maybe what this points to is that to defend that fourth premise of stage one, it's really an inference to the best explanation rather than following by definition from non-contingency. So like, what would the metaphysical principle here be that would explain contingent things? Something to the effect that there must be something or other? I mean, or is that understating the point?
Two things. One thing is that, to run the criticism that I made, the objector to stage one of the contingency argument, I just want the audience to just know this. I know you know this, but I want the audience to know this. The objector who is running my criticism does not have to roll up their sleeves and like provide an explanation in terms of metaphysical principles or something like that, like flesh it out. They only need to point out that in order for the proponent's argument to work, the proponent needs to rule this sort of explanation out, or any other sort of explanation that doesn't cite the activity of a being. Like again, like structural explanations, other sorts of explanations as well. So they can just put the point as, listen, I don't need to put forward an explanation. You're the one who's trying to convince me that there's a necessary being. You're the one who needs to rule this sort of thing out if you want me to infer that the necessary being is an explanation. Because you're assuming that the only explanation, or at least the best explanation, would have to be in terms of a being. Why should I accept that? What's so bad about other maybe candidate kinds of explanation? How do you rule those out? How do you know that those are worse explanations? So if the proponent doesn't justify that, then their argument would be undercut. So that's just one higher level thing to say at this point. Technically speaking, I don't need to roll up my sleeves and give an explanation here in order to mount the kind of criticism. But here's a very unsatisfying explanation. I say it's unsatisfying because I know that no theist is going to like. I mean, very few theists are going to like this, but like, think of it as proof of concept. Okay, so they're gonna hate. I mean,
I haven't heard that phrase in a very long time.
I mean, anyway, you guys. You're going to hate this explanation. I mean, everyone's going to hate this explanation, okay? But, like, again, I'm not saying that this is a good explanation or that this explanation is true, okay? It's just like here, what might such a non-causal explanation even look like? Or what, like, an explanation that doesn't cite the activity of a being? So the explanation would basically say, it would have two kind of components. One would be that the past can't be finite. The past has to be infinite. So that's one component of the explanation. Any past would have to be finite. Any past would have to be infinite. Why might we think that? Well, one might think that if we could have a finite past, well, then the past would. Seems like the past would, at least if we accept the contingency. So the contingency arguer should spot us this. If the past were finite, well then, like, plausibly, it would seem like the past would have to have an explanation in terms of a being. The contingency arguer should spot me that. So it's almost like an internal criticism now. But anyway, if we think that the past is finite, then the past would have to have. I could run this as a kind of internal critique of their view, a kind of quote-unquote internal critique, rather offering an explanation that should be acceptable by their lights, or at least this aspect of which should be acceptable by their lights. That's one way that I could do it, but another way that I could do it, this actually, what I'm about to say is compatible with the general objection that I'm running. So what we could say is that if the past were finite, well, then there would have to be a cause of the past. We might think that whatever begins has a cause, and if past time began, then it would have to have a cause. Now, this is compatible with thinking that the collection of all, whatever begins as a cause is compatible with thinking that the whole collection of contingent things does not have an explanation in terms of a being. Okay, those are compatible. So spot me that anything that's finite towards the past, including the whole past itself, would have to have a cause. Well, if that's the case, well, then the cause of the past would have to be timeless. And then the explanation would continue. It seems like there can't be a timeless cause of temporal things. First, I mean, just timeless to temporal causation just seems very unintuitive, seems very odd, seems very implausible. We have good inductive evidence that causation is an essentially temporal relation. It's very unclear how to relate a timeless thing to time, especially if we take a dynamic theory of time, etc. So, like, you get into all these puzzles and paradoxes and difficulties if you posit a timeless cause of temporal reality. So basically, if past time were finite, it would have to have a cause, and specifically a timeless cause, because the cause of all of time itself can't be within time. But there can't be a timeless cause of time, and so it follows that past time is not finite. Past time has to be infinite. Okay, so that's one sort of aspect of the explanation, that past time must be infinite. And then we bring in a certain theory of metaphysical modality called branching actualism, defended by a wide number of philosophers, has a number of theoretical virtues, and you can get into the modality literature to explain those sorts of virtues as a theory. But basically, the long story short of branching actualism is that things are possible in virtue of branching away from the actual world. So, like, things are possible in virtue of being a possible divergence from the actual history of things by means of the indeterministic causal powers of actual things. So, like, possibilities are ultimately rooted in or grounded in the actual causal powers of things throughout history. And that's why it's called branching actualism. So, like, actualism, the actual world is prior to different non-actual possibilities, and things are only possible in virtue of, like, branching away from the actual world at some point. Now, it actually turns out that if you have an infinite past together with this branching actualist view, it's just necessarily the case that there's an infinite past, because there's no, like, possible branch away from the actual history, which doesn't have an infinite history. Because, like, at any point throughout our infinite past, the past is infinite from the perspective of that point.
It's already there.
The past is infinite from that perspective. So then we'd get that it's necessarily the case that there are temporal things And okay, technically speaking, that's not it's necessarily the case that there are contingent things. But if we think that, time passes in virtue of various causal goings on, various causal processes, which is a very popular theory of time, causal processes always involve certain contingent things either coming into existence or going out of existence, or at least certain contingent processes coming into existence and going out of existence. That's just what a causal process is. And so then it would follow that since it's necessarily the case that there is a temporal series, and the temporal series are grounded in certain contingent goings on, it's necessarily the case that there are some contingent things. Why do we have this particular collection of contingent things? Well, I mean, there had to be some collection of contingent things. It's it's necessarily, we just got that, it's necessarily the case that there's some collection of contingent things, and this is one of the possible ones that we could have gotten. And so then that gives us an explanation of why we have this particular collection. Now, you might think that's not a particularly satisfying explanation of why we have this particular collection, but I mean, theism faces the same sort of issue. Why do we have this particular collection under theism? Well, you could try to say, well, because God chose this particular collection. But again, that's just another contingent fact. So why did God make this particular choice as opposed to any other particular choice that he could have made? And you might cite certain reasons being efficacious. But again, whether a reason is efficacious is a contingent fact. And we're going to have to ultimately bottom out in something necessary. And so then we can ask, well, why were these reasons the efficacious ones as opposed to these other reasons being the efficacious ones? And ultimately, you just have to say, well, listen, some of God's reasons had to be efficacious in leading to some choice of God's, either to create or not to create. And this was just one of the possible reasons that could have been efficacious. And that's all there is to it. So long as you have a necessary thing explaining contingent things, at some point, you're not going to be able to provide a contrastive explanation of why you got this particular contingent result as opposed to one of the others, because whatever you're explaining that result in terms of is necessary. And so it's the same across different possible worlds, and so you can't point to any difference within the necessary thing which could explain why you got one of these things in one world as opposed to another of these things in another world. So anyway, let me just take a step back. Again, I said that it may not be a particularly satisfying explanation, but you can sort of see how I haven't cited the activity of a being to explain why there are contingent things. Instead, the explanation is fundamentally there are contingent things because there had to be contingent things. And why did there have to be contingent things? And I gave an explanation in terms of, given a particular theory of modality, and given the past infinitude of reality, it follows from those that, and given a particular theory of time, a very popular theory of time, there had to be contingent things. And again, we can ask, well, what explains these theories and so on, but that's a separate explanatory project. So anyway, again, it's a proof of concept. It's a very controversial explanation. I'm not saying that it's a good or successful explanation, but again, it's just trying to show how it's at least conceptually possible that you could have contingent things being explained, but not explained in terms of a being.
Okay, that was an abstract argument, but I followed it. I know the point
I'm
you're
sorry,
making, and
this is so difficult to explain.
No. You have to get abstract. You have to at this level. But I give you the proof of concept. I think you successfully proved the idea to me. I know what it would be to have an explanation, but not in terms of it being. It comes at a cost with these very extensive philosophical maneuvering. But I obviously can't assess that explanation and give it justice in the time we have. I mean, to me, the weakest point of it, other than branching actualism, which I know nothing about, so I'll just have to table that for now, would be the point about the necessary past infinitude of the universe or of time, because I don't necessarily see the incoherence with a certain kind of timeless cause, depending on how we frame the idea. So, if that point goes out the window, then that kind of the entire argument falls because it needs that step.
And just for the audience, again, I was just trying to show what even could a sort of explanation like this look like. Again, that's all that I was really going for. And I myself, at least under certain views of time, I think I can make sense of a timeless cause of temporal things. And so, there are certain aspects of this explanation that I myself am also critical of, at least under certain views. And, but like the proponent, I mean, return to the point that I was making earlier and emphasizing, like the proponent of this objection, again, doesn't need to actually like give an explanation and justify their explanation. They just need to say like, listen, here's like a candidate explanation, and the burden is on you guys to show that there couldn't be any explanation like this, like a non-causal explanation in terms of something other than a being. And so like, again, the onus is on the proponent of the argument to rule these sorts of things out if they want us to accept a necessary being as the explanation.
Well, I was going to say devil's advocate, but theist advocate here. A counterpoint. I do think the only way they can defend this step is as an inference to the best explanation. And insofar as you're doing an inference to the best explanation, it's inductive. You can't rule anything out. It's just a matter of what explanations do we have, which ones have been proposed that we can think of that have enough detail to actually be a concrete explanation. And then we assess them. And we say that comparatively, the explanation in terms of a necessary being is superior to these other explanations. So in that context, it does make sense to ask the opponent of this objection, well, what explanation are you thinking of? Because I worry that gesturing towards a very vaguely defined explanation is just not giving an explanation at all. And so then in the context of an inference to the best explanation, well, no explanation isn't going to be better than one that you've proposed. What do you think about that?
You know, I mean, I appreciate it.
Kind of. I think that's probably right.
No, I appreciate that sort of pushback, because I think these sorts of inference to the best explanation, you know, abductive, inductive, Bayesian approaches to these premises is going to be more defensible than the sort of like deductive and like trying to give us like a very, very high degree of confidence in the relevant premises. Yeah, so about your point there. One thing that they could say is like they could offer this explanation and still pose the challenge, well, I think your explanation is considerably better than mine. And so then it still is something of a defensive maneuver. Like, again, I've given this like hypothetical explanation, and I think yours is considerably better than mine. And then, you know, we're going to get into the weeds. Like, you know, they may bring up objections to branching actualism, or they may propose certain views on which timeless causation is, you know, coherent or something like that. Or not only coherent, but it would have to be like not terribly implausible, etc. So I think just assessing that maneuver, we would have to roll up our sleeves. And I mean, let's not pretend that it's all hunky-dory on the theist side. I mean, like, you know, we can't just say, oh, there's a necessary being and that did it. It's like, well, okay, how did the necessary being explain it? Well, we appeal to some, like, maybe, like, libertarian free choice. It's like, oh, man, that's a whole can of worms. Have you seen the libertarian free will literature? It's like dozens of problems. I mean, it's like there are the worries about the coherence of libertarian freedom, worries about explicability, worries about the relevant control that would have to be operative in that, worries about how reasons relate to one's choices. Do they, like, cause it? Are they non-causally relevant? The theist side has lots of also potential difficulties with this explanation as well. And so it's not clear they would have the best explanation. And, of course, when we're assessing best explanations, we have to take into account our total evidence. Like, what? And then we're starting to get into, like, theory comparison. Because, you know, like, is it really the best?
Sure. So at the end of the day, you know, it might be the best explanation is what you're saying, I take it, is it might be the best explanation of, like, this one piece of evidence. But then when we zoom out and examine our total evidence base, theism still fails.
Well, maybe. That was just the point about...
all things
yeah, I mean, that was just the point about total evidence. I mean, there are still worries about whether theism, even in this restricted case, provides the best explanation. Because, again, like, the theist has to roll up their sleeves and give us... You know, again, if we are really fleshing out this alternative explanation to the depth that I was, giving these precise theories and whatnot, it seems like, you know, the theist can't just say, necessary being did it. You know, they'd have to sort of flesh out their theory. Well, how? You know, okay, by free will. It's like, oh, well, how does that work? Libertarian free will, that's a... So one other thing on this as well. We might worry about inference to the best explanation, too. I mean... You know, there's like Van Frossen and various other empiricist objections to inference to the best explanation. You know, it's like, how do we know that, like, the theories that we have are not, like, how do we know that we're not deciding between the best theory of a bad lot of theories? You know, like, again, the non-theist I just came up, like, with that thing. You know, I've thought of this in the past, but, like, I just came up with that explanation on the spot. Like, how do we know that there isn't some even better non-causal explanation than the one that I just sort of came up with, and which isn't, significantly superior to both of the explanations that I just mentioned. So, like, one might also, again, I'm not saying that this is a successful objection, but, like, this is another point that we need to take into account at this juncture of the dialectic, that there are certain objections to inference to the best explanation as well. And we might worry that we've only been finding, or we might worry about how we're ruling out that we've found just the best explanation of a bad lot of explanations.
Fair enough. I grant you the point. I think my chief worries about a theistic explanation would be general issues with libertarian freedom, which I've always struggled with. And I hope to engage one day in a deep dive on the literature and then resolve these worries and be able to affirm libertarian freedom. But that's just a hope. That's just what I hope. But I grant your point. If it's comparative, that sword is going to cut both ways. And so the theist will have to defend the superiority of their explanation. It's not enough to just poke holes in other explanations. You have to show that yours has less holes. So anyway.
15 minutes. Let's go for 15 more minutes, and maybe we can do, just quickly at least, the evolutionary animal suffering thing.
Yep, that's exactly what I was going to say. So let's move on to the best argument for atheism, that is, for the claim that God does not exist, whatever you want to call the view that affirms that claim. And what do you think, Joe? What's the best argument for that?
Right, yeah. So, I mean, as always, as I said with the theistic argument, we're going to have to be looking at cumulative cases here. But alas, that's kind of cheating, so we're just going to pick a particular argument. And again, there are other candidates for what the best argument is, as with the theist case, and we just chose one. So this is one. And I'll actually be very brief, because we only have 15 minutes. Long story short, we know that very plausibly, like, sentient creatures capable of feeling pain have been around for hundreds of millions of years. And evolutionary history, then, is just like, a bloodbath of animals ripping each other to shreds, preying upon one another, parasitizing one another, languishing, and just a lot of suffering throughout evolutionary history. I mean, we're probably talking, like, I don't know the exact numbers, but I don't know, maybe like quintillions of animals or something? I don't know. Or at least quintillions of creatures capable of suffering. And that's a lot of suffering. And it seems like it's very surprising that God would choose this suffering-filled, horrific, languishing-filled process as the very means by which he brings about biological diversity and humans. That seems extremely surprising by my lights, that God would choose this sort of process. So under theism, this data of evolutionary animal suffering is very surprising, whereas under something like a naturalistic view, it's nowhere near as surprising. Fundamentally, the naturalistic... under naturalism, the universe is just, like, indifferent to the suffering and languishing of creatures. So it's not like there's an active force operative that's, like, cares about creatures and, was guiding the process and whatnot. So it's not terribly surprising that it would go horribly astray in various ways and involve lots of horrific suffering. So then, given that the data is much more surprising on one hypothesis than another, the data confirms one hypothesis over another. And so it gives us a lot of evidence for naturalism over theism. That's the basic argument.
Right. So what makes this argument different from just the traditional evidential problem of evil that focuses on the suffering of human agents? Do you think there are any particularly difficult issues that animal suffering throughout evolutionary history raises? Is it just the sheer quantity of it? Is it its resistance to our usual theodicies or explanations for why God allows suffering that seem to be inapplicable to animal suffering? I mean, what justifies this as a separate argument for atheism versus just the good old problem of evil?
I think it's both the ones that you mentioned. There has been much more non-human animal suffering throughout evolutionary history than human suffering. That's one thing. And the second thing is there does seem to be a kind of a marked resistance of this problem to lots of the traditional ways of going about responding to the problem of evil, because it seems a lot less plausible to say that animals are, like, growing in virtue or growing in character as a result of suffering. It's not like the pig is like, yes, I've experienced suffering and I now. The pigs don't do that. It's not like You can appeal to animals deserving it. It's not like you can say that animals are like, they have free will and that's super valuable. So, it's like the lion is just choosing to, voraciously rip the guts out of the elephant while it's alive and, suffering for days like that. It's not very plausible. So like free will seems less plausible in this case. Soul building seems less plausible in this case. Like punishment theodicies seem less plausible in this case. And the theodicies that are applicable just don't seem plausible to me. You need like regularity in order to make choices. But it's like, hold on a second, to make choices. It's like, this has been going on for hundreds of millions of years without there being any moral agents like humans to make choices. And you can have regularity without having a bloodbath. They could be photosynthesizing creatures, or they could like get their sustenance in ways other than ripping each other to shreds. And so you can have regularity without this bloodbath. And regularity also just doesn't seem to adequately justify it. Like you go on the ethics board after making this horrific experiment where like animals are basically being tortured, and you're like, oh well, it's like a regular. There's regularity in my experiment. It's like, what? That doesn't justify it. I think it's considerably more difficult for the theist to respond.
I think you're right. I think it would be hopeless to try to challenge the premise that this body of evidence is not terribly unlikely given naturalism. That strikes me as obviously true. That if naturalism or the indifference hypothesis, or however you want to phrase the atheistic alternative, if that were true, then this is essentially the kind of thing we should expect. It's not terribly unlikely. I think the theist will need to challenge the second premise of this Bayesian or inductive argument, that this body of evidence has a low likelihood given theism. I think the best kind of response is to say that the likelihood is just inscrutable. It would be the same kind of response ultimately that I think the skeptical theist gives in the case of the general problem of evil. I think it's the only strategy that has a chance of succeeding. That's not to say I think it succeeds, but I can't see how any theodicy would be applicable, and so I think we would have to give the more modest defensive claim that there just is no way to generate a particular likelihood given our epistemic limitations. So the skeptical theist will say that our inability to come up with a reason that would justify God in permitting this evil gives us no reason to think that there is no such reason. And they'll cite all sorts of cognitive limitations that human beings have that suggest that even if there were such a reason, there's no reason to expect that we would know about it. So obviously there's a whole body of literature on skeptical theism and how many problems there might or might not be with it. But theists, it's certainly taken hold among theistic philosophers, the skeptical theistic research program. That is true. That doesn't mean it's correct, but it has some core plausibility, right? So why, Joe, does that defense not work here?
There are like a billion things running through my mind right now. So what should I say?
I realize, yeah. You know too much about this topic.
No. It's just I just have thought a lot about this thing specifically, and so it's like what should I say about this? Skeptical theist. So one thing is like, listen, if I were a theist, and I advise theists to take this maneuver, and I do know a number of theists to do it, but it seems to me that they're in like the extreme minority. If I were a theist, I'd just be like, yeah, clearly this is like evidence against God's existence, but it's just like we have lots of evidence for God's existence, and ultimately when I weigh it up, the evidence for God's existence sufficiently counterbalances this evidence against God's existence so that I'm justified in accepting God's existence, and that's where the overall evidence points. If I were a theist, that's my response. Clearly this is evident. So that's how I would go if I were a theist. Yeah, skeptical theism is interesting. There are lots of different skeptical theisms. A few things. One, Nevin Kleimenhager has this really good paper about this sort of inscrutability response, and what he points out is that the probability of hypothesis, conditional on our total body of evidence, is a function of the probability of that evidence, of each of the pieces of evidence conditional on the hypothesis. And so then, if it's inscrutable, what the probability is of a given piece of evidence conditional on the hypothesis, it just mathematically follows, in fact, that the probability of the hypothesis conditional on all of our evidence is itself inscrutable. So then, this person would be forced, whoever makes this move, they'd be forced to say that the probability of theism itself, conditional on our total evidence, is inscrutable. And that doesn't look good. That does not look good. Like, they can't say, I mean, they can't say what the probability is. I mean, maybe it's 0. Maybe it's like point... I mean, I guess, you could restrict it. Like, you could say, okay, it's inscrutable between 0 and 1 or something like that. Okay, so then maybe you can't rule out that it's 0. But, like, maybe it's 1 in a trillion. Maybe it's 0.7. Maybe it's, this is not a good position for theists to be in. And it seems like if someone is forced to say that the probability of theism itself, conditional on all of our evidence, is inscrutable, it seems like they should at least minimally suspend judgment on the question of God's existence. So that's one objection. I don't know if I should pause or if I should just keep on going with the worries for skeptical theism.
Well, briefly, just because you mentioned this very specific objection that's relatively new, and I'm very pleased you did, because I have a paper that is partially in response to Kleimenhager's argument that he makes in that paper, and it's under review. It's past the R&R, so I mean, fingers crossed it'll probably make it through. But right, it was in response to a reviewer who brought up exactly that objection, and so I had to read the essay and then think about it very, very hard. And what I argue is that this position that Kleimenhager advances has counterintuitive implications if we demand that even inscrutable data feature into our total evidence. And I think the most plausible response, or the most plausible position, is to say that truly inscrutable data observations ought to be disregarded when formulating your total evidence base and the posterior probability of a hypothesis. And I give a relatively robust thought experiment to spell out that intuition. I mean, the details aren't important, and we'll see what the reviewer takes of it. But it seems to me that if we grant that there are true, and here's the first point to make, is that truly inscrutable likelihoods of various observations are really rare and difficult to give examples of outside the context of evil and theism in these very recondite philosophical debates, because we always will have background information that serves to rein in any relevant likelihood. Even if we grant that we can have ranged likelihoods like that, 0.5 to 0.75, to really say we have no idea from 0 to 1 at all takes a very extreme case. And I think insofar as we have that data, it shouldn't feature into our total evidence base from which we generate the posterior probability of a hypothesis. So if that's feasible, then Kleimenhager's argument fails, and the point fails. It's relatively new in terms of my response, so I'm curious to see what people make of it, and maybe it doesn't succeed. But I think that one who's committed to inscrutable probabilities could take that implication as a reason for thinking that you can't assess the posterior probability of the hypothesis, as a reason for thinking that something has gone wrong in our principle of total evidence that we're appealing to.
That's interesting. I'd like to read this paper once it's out. So you're gonna have to send it to me. I want to.
I got you, Jeff.
I want to refrain from commenting on it until reading the proposal, so that I can more fully understand it. So
sure, give the detail.
So I guess just like a few other worries one might have about skeptical theism. I mean, it seems to seriously hamper theism's predictive ability. We have these various fine-tuning arguments and psychophysical harmony arguments and whatnot, and if we're so in the dark about God's reasons, and maybe psychophysical harmony just ultimately facilitates just greater suffering in the end, or if we're just so in the dark either about the connections between goods and evils, or and that's one way to go with skeptical theism, or we're so in the dark about the weights of God's reasons favoring his actions to bring about various outcomes, then it seems like this is going to be it's going to infect natural theology in various repugnant ways. So that's that's another thing that worries me about skeptical theism. I know Paul Draper has an interesting point about skeptical theism and like these evidential arguments. So it's like, listen, I mean, we are aware of at least a number of, like, let's just focus on the reasons of which we are aware, and they strongly tell against actualizing an evolutionary process like we see it. And then, okay, you know, maybe there are various reasons of which we're unaware, favoring actualizing the evolutionary process like that. But okay, also maybe there are reasons of which we're unaware that that additionally disfavor actualizing the evolutionary process. And you know, without any reason to think that one of these is stronger than the other, it seems like they cancel out. And so we're just left with the first order reasons of which we're aware, which strongly tell against actualizing evolutionary animal suffering. And so it still seems, at least prima facie, that the evidence is still quite improbable under theism. So that's another way that one might go. And again, there are many more objections to, you know, these skeptical theist hypotheses. And I think, you know, one can be reasonable in accepting skeptical theism. It's not like I think that it's irrational or anything like that. But I have my worries.
I have my worries too. I think that I almost think that given its huge range of applicability, like considering its huge range of applicability for undermining all sorts of inferences to and against God's existence, that should make us quite skeptical about the actual cogency of its central claim. It almost does too much, and you can appeal to skeptical theism in so many contexts and say, oh, well, we just don't know what God would do. After a while, you begin to think, maybe we are going wrong somewhere here.
Yeah.
So I realize that's not a well-articulated objection, but it's been my impression.
I just want to add to that as well. Like, it is worth noting that, like, at least a number of skeptical theists themselves are like, yeah, dude, like, that's why I don't make the fine-tuning argument or the psychophysical harmony argument. You know, like, Hudson has this whole talk on YouTube, and, like, I think he's got a number of papers on this where he's like, yeah, I'm a skeptical theist, so I can't run the fine-tuning argument. And then he, like, criticizes the fine-tuning argument, in fact, by virtue of a skeptical theism. So anyway, it's worth at least noting for the audience that, like, a number, not all skeptical theists, not all skeptical theists go this route, but, like, a number of them are like, yeah, of course, skeptical theism has this consequence, and you know, they just like lather it on. They're like, yeah,
just accept
I'll take it.
Right. At least they're consistent, because I do think so. Again, not to sing my own praises, but it's relevant. That paper I have under review is looking at skeptical theism and fine-tuning arguments, and so it struck me as an undertreated area, and it's a case study in the broader issue of integrating skeptical theism with natural theology. I think the vast majority of skeptical theistic frameworks that have been argued for, because there are slightly different, there are variations, there's not just one framework that you use to argue for these skeptical theistic claims. The vast majority of them entail that there's no basis for the key premises in these theistic arguments. I do end up arguing that there's one that seems to allow us to hold on to the inscrutability of evil, but still affirm the other premises of like the fine-tuning argument that appeal to what God would do. But I think the vast majority of the time, and this is a fairly niche argument anyway, the vast majority of the time, skeptical theists cannot also advocate arguments for theism, which is a huge conclusion because there are lots of theistic philosophers who go the skeptical theistic route, but then also propose arguments for theism. And I don't know if it's just they haven't thought about it super deeply, or if they think, well, surely this could be resolved somehow. But I hope to have shown most of the time, almost all the time, depending on what kind of skeptical theist you are, you can't. You simply can't. And that's an impression that is shared by many people. So I think that's an important point. Well, Joe, I want to let you go. I want to be respectful of your time. But I really appreciate you having this conversation with me. I think this was very interesting. I hope it was fruitful for other people listening.
Yeah, and thanks for having me on. I like how we got into some of the cutting edge aspects of my thought on some of these arguments. So, as I said, I'm sort of when I say cutting edge, I don't mean like super cool and refined and amazing. I mean like this is at the edge of my thinking on some of these arguments where I'm like I'm trying to see further into the dialectic. I'm actively toying with these ideas, and so I was glad that we were able to get into that sort of territory.
Well, thank you, Joe, and best of luck on the rest of the PhD.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks.